There is no data, and you know this. There is no data, there is no research that proves any of that nonsense. None. Even
you'd have to be more specific about what data and what nonsense you're talking about.
That law enforcement officers treat black males different than white males in policing in these urban centers.
There is data that supports
There is not data.
No. The president spoke about it. Cedric Alexander, who is a law enforcement officer.
The president has been lying about it. He said it again the other day when he said black males are 2 times more likely to be shot by a law enforcement officer than white males. Don, that is a lie. There is no data, and you know this. There is no data, there is no research that proves any of that nonsense. There is no data, and you know this. There is no data, there is no research that proves any of that nonsense.
Today, the Department of Justice announces the outcome of our investigation and issues a 163-page report detailing our findings. We conclude that there is reasonable cause to believe that BPD engages in a pattern or practice of conduct that violates the Constitution and federal anti-discrimination law. BPD engages in a pattern or practice of making unconstitutional stops, searches, and arrests, using enforcement strategies that produce severe and unjustified disparities in the rates of stops, searches, and arrests of African Americans, using excessive force, and retaliating against people engaging in constitutionally protected
There is no data, and you know this. There is no data, there is no research that proves any of that nonsense. None.
How you doing, sir?
Hey.
Howdy.
Can I see your IDs?
No, sir. No.
Why not?
Because I don't have to. I'm not doing any crime.
Okay. Any particular reason why you're carrying the AR especially around at this point?
I'm just exercising my right.
I understand that, but is there a reason why you're doing it?
I just want to walk around.
Of course. David Noble, I'm hoping to my AR-15.
He pulled out the gun. He's getting down. The gun. He's just walking up and carrying.
There is no data, and you know this. There is no data, there is no research that proves any of that nonsense. None. Even
you'd have to be more specific about what data and what nonsense you're talking about.
That law enforcement officers treat black males different than white males in policing in these urban centers.
There is data that supports
There is not data.
Of January 28, 2015, where his life changed forever. He was stopped by the defendant, a then Inkster police officer, and his partner, Officer Zelenuski. Mr. Dent was stopped for a minor traffic offense and ordered out of his vehicle. With his hands extended out of his driver's window, he was grabbed out, thrown to the ground, and struck 16 times in the head by the defendant. In his attempt to arrest him, he was thrown onto a window shield of a patrol car, bleeding profusely from a head injury. The responding police officers arrived as the defendant is wrestling the defendant to the ground. Mr. Dent was struck, kicked, and tased while on the ground by what appeared to be a group of angry, anxious police officers that celebrated after the defendant was beaten and cuffed. The video in the car shows the police officers fist bumping as a celebratory act of bravery by the defendant and his cohorts. But the one image that struck out to the court was looking at Mr. Dent in his cell, shaking his head. In disbelief of what had occurred to him. If his conduct was indicative of what he was thinking, I would have thought this. What crime did I commit? Being a black man in a Cadillac, stopped for a minor traffic offense by a group of racist police officers looking to do a nigger. As police officer John Zelenowski, auxiliary police officer, testified in court too, in his response to a text, was quoted as saying, "At least give me the satisfaction of knowing that you're out there beating up niggas right now."
There is no
LOL.
data, and you know this. There is no data, there is no research that proves any of that nonsense. None. Even
You'd have to be more specific about what data and what nonsense you're talking about.
that law enforcement officers treat black males different than white males in policing in these urban
There
centers.
is data that's
There
Authorities
is
in
not
Michigan
data.
were called to Lamphere High School in Madison Heights after there were some reports of a man with a gun walking near and then onto the campus. When cops showed up, they were confronted by a gentleman who was not too happy about the fact that they were investigating him, especially considering the fact that Michigan has open carry laws. Now, the video that you're about to see is incredible because I can't really imagine most people getting away with what he just got away with. Take a look.
I'm guessing dispatch got a report of somebody walking with a rifle slung over their back.
That would be my assumption.
Right. So, I mean, in a legal sense, it's just as legal as me walking down the street with my dog. You don't need to have your hand on your gun, man. Oh, you do?
That's part of what we do. Okay.
What's
Let me
that?
explain something to you. Okay.
Can I
It's a
put-
resting area.
It's an arresting area?
Sir.
It's a resting.
Resting area? Can I rest my hand on my gun?
Sir.
Do what you feel you need to do, sir.
Will you shoot me?
Do what you need to do.
So you got your hand on your gun because it's comfortable, but we both know that if I were to do something similar, you guys would pull your guns on me and maybe even shoot me. I'm advising you guys that you need to take a long, hard look in the mirror. I don't know if any of y'all ever served in the military, but the oath you took to the Constitution, you take something very similar when you pin that shiny little badge to your chest, do you not?
Okay.
Does that mean anything to you?
It does. It does.
Does it?
It does. Yes, sir.
How about you, sir? It does. How about you? Hey, Mr. Earp, how about you? Come on, Wyatt, answer my question. Apparently you don't understand that you don't have the authority to tell me what to do.
Okay. That's.
Okay, all right. See you, tough guy.
Bye.
Bye. See you
There
later.
is no data, and you know this. There is no data, there is no research that proves any of that nonsense. None. Even
You'd have to be more specific about what data and what nonsense you're talking about.
that law enforcement officers treat black males different than white males in policing in these urban
There
centers.
is data that's.
There is not data.
Good afternoon. I'd like to take the next few moments to address the two investigations that the Justice Department has been conducting in Ferguson, Missouri, these last several months. Also released by the Justice Department today, this investigation found a community that was deeply polarized, a community where deep distrust and hostility often characterized interactions between police and area residents, a community where local authorities consistently approached law enforcement not as a means for protecting public safety, but as a way to generate revenue, a community where both policing and municipal court practices were found to be disproportionately harmful to African American residents, a community where this harm frequently appears to stem, at least in part, from racial bias, both implicit and explicit, and a community where all of these conditions, unlawful practices, and constitutional violations have not only severely undermined the public trust, eroded police legitimacy, and made local residents less safe, but created an intensely charged atmosphere where people feel under assault and under siege by those who are charged to serve and to protect them. Now, of course, violence is never justified, but seen in this context, amid a highly toxic environment, defined by mistrust and resentment, stoked by years of bad feelings, and spurred by illegal and misguided practices, it's not difficult to imagine how a single tragic incident set off the city of Ferguson like a powder keg. In a sense, members of the community may not have been responding only to a single isolated confrontation, but also to a pervasive, corrosive, and deeply unfortunate lack of trust, attributable to numerous constitutional violations by their law enforcement officials, including First Amendment abuses, unreasonable searches and seizures, and excessive and dangerous use of force, exacerbated by severely disproportionate use of these tactics against African Americans, and driven by overriding pressure from the city to use law enforcement not as a public service, but as a tool for raising revenue. Now, according to our investigation, this emphasis on revenue generation through policing has fostered unconstitutional practices or practices that contribute to constitutional violations at nearly every level of Ferguson's law enforcement system. Ferguson police officers issued nearly 50% more citations in the last year than they did in 2010, an increase that has not been driven or even accompanied by a rise in crime. As a result of this excessive reliance on ticketing, today the city generates a significant amount of revenue from the enforcement of code provisions. Along with taxes and other revenue streams in 2010, the city collected over $1.3 million in fines and fees collected by the court. For fiscal year 2015, Ferguson's city budget anticipates the revenues to exceed $3 million, more than double the total from just 5 years prior. Our review of the evidence and our conversations with police officers have shown that significant pressure is brought to bear on law enforcement personnel to deliver on these revenue increases. Once the system is primed for maximizing revenue, starting with fines and fine enforcement, the city relies on the police force to serve essentially as a collection agency for the municipal court, rather than as a law enforcement entity focused primarily on maintaining and promoting public safety. And a wide variety of tactics, including disciplinary measures, are used to ensure certain levels of ticketing by individual officers, regardless of public safety needs. As a result, it has become commonplace in Ferguson for officers to charge multiple violations for the same conduct. 3 or 4 charges for a single stop is considered fairly routine. Some officers even compete to see who can issue the largest number of citations during a single stop, a total that in at least one instance rose as high as 14. And we have observed that even minor code violations can sometimes result in multiple arrests, jail time, and payments that exceed the cost of the original ticket many times over. Now, for example, in 2007, one woman received 2 parking tickets that together totaled $152. To date, she has paid $550 in fines and fees to the city of Ferguson. She has been arrested twice for having unpaid tickets, and she has spent 6 days in jail. Yet today, she still inexplicably owes Ferguson $541. And her story is only one of dozens of similar accounts that our investigation uncovered. Now, over time, it's clear that this culture of enforcement actions being disconnected from the public safety needs of the community, and often to the detriment of community residents, has given rise to a disturbing and unconstitutional pattern or practice. Our investigation showed that Ferguson police officers routinely violate the Fourth Amendment in stopping people without reasonable suspicion, arresting them without probable cause, and using unreasonable force against them. According to the police department's own records, its officers frequently infringe on residents' First Amendment rights. They interfere with the right to record police activities, and they make enforcement decisions based on the way individuals express themselves. Now, many of these constitutional violations have become routine. Now, for instance, even though it's illegal for police officers to detain a person, even briefly, without a reasonable suspicion, it's become common practice for officers in Ferguson to to stop pedestrians and to request identification for no reason at all. And even in cases where police encounters start off as constitutionally defensible, we found that they frequently and rapidly escalate and end up blatantly and unnecessarily crossing the line. During the summer of 2012, one Ferguson police officer detained a 32-year-old African-American man who had just finished playing basketball at a park. The officer approached the man while he was sitting in his car and he was resting. The car's windows appeared to be more heavily tinted than Ferguson's code allowed, so the officer did have legitimate grounds to question him. But with no apparent justification, the officer proceeded to accuse the man of being a pedophile. He prohibited the man from using his cell phone and ordered him to get out of his car for a pat-down search, even though he had no reason to suspect that the man was armed. And when the man objected, citing his constitutional rights, the police officer drew his service weapon, pointed it at the man's head, and arrested him on 8 different counts. Now, this arrest caused the man to lose his job. Unfortunately, this event appears to have been anything but an isolated incident. Our investigation showed that members of Ferguson's police force frequently escalate rather than diffuse tensions with the residents that they encounter. And such actions are sometimes accompanied by First Amendment violations, including arresting people for talking back to officers, for recording their public activities, or engaging in other conduct that is constitutionally protected. This behavior not only exacerbates tensions in its own right, it has the effect of stifling community confidence that is absolutely vital for effective policing. And this in turn deepens the widespread distrust provoked by the department's other unconstitutional exercises of police power, none of which is more harmful than its pattern of excessive force. Now, among the incidents of excessive force discovered by our comprehensive review, some resulted from stops or arrests that had no legal basis to begin with. Others were punitive or retaliatory in nature. The police department's routine use of tasers was found to be not merely unconstitutional, but abusive and dangerous. Records showed a really disturbing history of using unnecessary force against people with mental illness. And our findings indicated that the overwhelming majority of force, almost 90%, is directed against African Americans. Now, this deeply alarming statistic points to one of the most pernicious aspects of the conduct that our investigation uncovered, that these policing practices disproportionately harm African American residents. In fact, our review of the evidence found no alternative explanation for the disproportionate impact on African American residents other than implicit and explicit racial bias.